Episode number 8 of the WildFed podcast, The Secret Life of Seaweeds with Jessica Muhlin, is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival is proud to introduce its new line of organically produced but technically advanced CBD products, CBD3. The line is called CBD3 because it utilizes 3 CBD extracts in one. A powerful, scientifically validated nanoshell-delivered CBD that's designed to get into your body fast. A thoroughly researched and scientifically studied liposomally delivered nutraceutical CBD that stays in the body substantially longer than other CBD formulas, and a traditionally made, balanced, broad-spectrum hemp extract that delivers all the incredible benefits of the cannabis plant without the THC. CBD3 is studied, lab-tested for purity, and delivers faster results that last longer. It's a full line, so there's a formula with a strength and a price tag to meet your needs. Check out CBD3 at surthrival.com to learn more. If you've been listening to this show, you already know that WildFed is more than a podcast. We've created an incredible premium TV show all about hunting, fishing, foraging, and of course, food. In each 30-minute episode, we hunt or fish for an animal, we gather a plant or mushroom, and we bring that food back to chefs and cooks who prepare incredible meals that we share with the people we forage with. We've self-produced this show without the support of big networks or platforms, and that means we're distributing it ourselves. Head over to wild-fed.com to see the trailer for Season 1 and all the individual episodes, and to learn how you can see the show or participate in our upcoming 9-week online program that's designed to get you started or to deepen your experience of the wild foods lifestyle. Hey, thanks for all those 5-star ratings and the incredible reviews over at iTunes. Listen, you only have to do this once to move the needle on how the show gets put in front of new listeners. You just go over to iTunes and hit the 5-star rating, assuming you think that we warrant it, and then write up a short but honest review, and you're done. You're done. Anytime you hear me asking, you can think to yourself, I'm all set. I've already given a little back to support Daniel and the WildFed team and their mission. It's instant gratification. And please know, we read all those reviews, and they mean a lot to us. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. This is episode 8, The Secret Life of Seaweeds with Jessica Muhlin. I'm excited to be doing an episode of the show on seaweed because I think they're often overlooked when we think about wild foods. They're delicious, at least when prepared well, and they're powerfully nutritious. They're also becoming widely available commercially, so even if you live far from the coast, you can probably still get wild or aquaculture grown sea vegetables wherever you live. In fact, if you're far from the sea, you probably need them, since nutrients wash downhill with the rain and make their way to the sea, where they're later incorporated into the tissues of marine algae. Seaweeds, in particular, Alaria esculenta, feature prominently in episode 5 of season 1 of the WildFed show, and we'll be following this episode up in the future with an interview with our friend Micah, who's a commercial seaweed forager, so you'll get that user-based perspective too. But today is a lesson from the biology side. Jessica Muhlin is a Ph.D. and an associate professor of marine biology in the Corning School of Ocean Studies at the Maine Maritime Academy. You're going to get smarter just listening to this interview, and it'll have nothing to do with me. Jessie's a brilliant phycologist. Phycology is the scientific study of algae, and she's about to give you a powerful crash course on marine botany. Seaweeds defy many of our best efforts to cleverly categorize life forms, and you'll hear my many amateur frustrations as she gently dismantles my most cherished illusions about the phylogeny of life. It's rare to meet an intellect of her stature who has such a casual and easygoing communication style. In other words, she takes this arcane topic and makes it easy to listen to. Still, you'll hear a lot of me lagging behind, trying to understand and simplify the incredible complexity of her field and the many things she's discussing here. We've got great rapport, and she's got a real mastery of the topic. So prepare to do a deep dive into the incredible hidden life of seaweeds. I'm here at the Maine Maritime Academy with Dr. Jessica Muhlin. How are you today?
Great.
Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about this place and what you do here.
Sure. Maine Maritime Academy is a small maritime college that's on the kind of tip of a peninsula in kind of in between mid-coast and down east Maine. And
you guys must be right on the kind of line of that.
it depends on where people call down east. If you're from Machias, Castine is not down east, and if you're from Wiscasset, Castine is not mid-coast. So we kind of fall in this unique. We usually say the peninsula to the west of Blue Hill,
it's
and people
understand. The politically correct way to say it. Exactly. The peninsula to the west of Blue Hill.
Exactly. And this institution was founded in 1941, traditionally to school people who would be in the merchant marines or to go off to sea. Wow. And in 1990.
So what were the studies then? It was navigating and seamanship.
Exactly. It was the two departments were deck and engine.
Wow, no kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And so in the 1990s, there started to be developing an ocean studies program.
Okay.
And so I'm a faculty member in the Corning School of Ocean Studies.
Okay. And so that's biological sciences and oceanographic stuff?
Yep. So students who are interested in the kind of organismal side of things are marine biology students, and students who are more interested in the systems of oceanography and kind of chemical, physical, biological oceanography are marine science. And we also have a dual degree where students can stay for a 5th year, and they've taken courses throughout their curriculum to then sit for their 200-ton Coast Guard license. So they have a small vessel operations associate's degree that they can get here too.
After you've done a 4-year program?
Yep.
Oh, no kidding.
So they get a bachelor's in science, and then they can get an associate's degree and have a...
And people who do that program, where do they usually end up?
They go everywhere.
Okay.
So some students end up going out to sea. Some students work for state or federal agencies. Some students end up going to graduate school, but it gives them kind of this unique opportunity pathway where they can either, do more of the maritime traditional seamanship aspect, or they can kind of go into the sciences. Drilling
down a little bit on your area of focus, what is it you do here, and what's your sort of area of expertise?
Sure. So I was hired in 2007 to be the faculty member in the Ocean Studies program to teach marine botany and to also teach genetics. And so I came here right from my Ph.D. program at the University of Maine. And so I had an expertise in marine botany and phycology, the study of algae. And I had also used molecular tools to answer ecological questions. Oh, okay. And so I was pigeonholed into genetics.
The genetic piece.
Correct.
Real quickly, how has genetics been... I see that in taxonomy, because phycology is recently have come to understand it represents its own kingdom of life, which I want to get into in a minute.
Sure.
But I see how taxonomy is being revolutionized by genetic research that I guess before, morphology sort of determined where things fit in the phylogenetic tree.
Yep.
How is it in phycology? Are things being shifted radically by genetics?
Very much so. So a good example is how to key out the seaweeds or any algae in general.
For people who don't know what you mean by key out, can you explain that?
Yeah, to identify them. So if you go out into the field or someone brings you a specimen and says, like, what is it? There are scientific keys that help you identify what the alga is. And they're often called dichotomous keys because it's sort of like a choose your own adventure. Is it brown or is it not brown?
And you go brown and then you flip to page 700.
Exactly. And then it says, is it fleshy or is it calcareous?
Calcareous, page 300.
Exactly. Although brown algae are often not calcareous.
Okay, never mind.
And so then it kind of leads you down this kind of narrowing path until you get to something that you identify. And traditionally, those taxonomic keys have always been based on morphological features that either are anatomical in structure or reproductive in structure. And so sometimes if you had a particular specimen that was not reproductive, you would have to stop it somewhere because you wouldn't have those features. Mm-hmm. Where molecular techniques and barcoding and fingerprinting has really helped is for lots of the seaweeds, there are not that many different ways that you can live and be successful in your particular habitat or ecosystem and have a unique morphology. So there are lots of things that look like blades or lots of things that look like filaments.
That's convergent?
Yeah, there's a lot of convergent evolution, and there's a lot of different stages of life histories or life cycles of seaweeds that look completely different. We call that heteromorphic. And so a really good example for that is the economically important seaweed that people know as nori. you can kind of consume in Japanese cuisines and Asian cuisines, and also we have a number of native species of Porphyra or Pyropia here in Maine. And it has these alternate life histories where the economically important one is this blade, and it's haploid, so it has only just one copy of the chromosomes. And the other part of its life history is diploid, but it looks like little filaments, and it burrows into calcareous shells. And so historically in the past, those were called two different...
Oh, they thought they were different organisms.
Totally. But they're the same.
Different parts of their...
Exactly. So there are many seaweeds that have what's called a heteromorphic alternation of generations, where one part of their life history, they look like one thing, and the other part of their life history, they look completely different.
In an individual's life cycle this happens, or these are two possible...
If you followed that particular individual throughout its entire life, it would go from being a haploid stage to a diploid stage.
Interesting.
And so...
so genetics has revealed that this is one organism that was thought...
Well, it was revealed in the 1940s that it was two separate... those two separate thought to be species were the same for culture studies. But molecular techniques can really help change that by being able to sequence them. Another good example for that is a lot of encrusting seaweeds. So I have some rocks over here. And like this particular kind of, it looks like a red stain on the rock.
Yeah.
And this is a particular type of red alga called Hildenbrandia.
Okay, so for people listening who can't see this, I'm looking at something that I just would think was like iron deposit in this in this stone or something.
Yeah, but it's an alga. It's a red alga that's encrusting.
Okay.
And it's the genetics and some of the culture experiments that have been going on kind of in conjunction with the molecular techniques have demonstrated that this particular genus has a lot more diversity than we originally thought.
Okay.
And so the keys, those identification techniques that people use on morphology are definitely in need of revision.
Yeah.
And so so
there's shakeup going on right now.
Very much so. Yeah.
And phycology in general, I want to talk, because you were talking about marine botany. And so we recently sat down with Micah Woodcock, somebody you know, and I know is really respected in the state for his work with seaweeds as a forager of seaweeds.
Correct.
And there was a moment where I said plant, and he said, no, seaweeds are protist. And I think...
Daniel's mind got blown.
Well, I'll be really honest. Like in this year, that has been the single most riveting thing that was revealed to me, in the sense that I think I've reached an age where I don't encounter as often so many shocking things that like I have to go in and like reorganize all the categories in my mind.
Yeah.
And I just had, I don't know why, but I always thought that seaweeds were plants.
Yeah.
So first of all, marine botany, is that just a catch-all that phycology falls into, or how does this piece separate out?
It does. So for marine botany, it catches all the marine macrophytes, so the marine macroalgae that are out there, and all the marine microalgae that are out there. So not the seaweeds, but the phytoplankton, so the diatoms, the dinoflagellates, and the coccolithophores, and all these other small little things that live in the marine system.
Are diatoms not animals?
No, they are a member of...
They are algae.
Yeah, they are, completely.
But they form a calcareous shell?
They form a siliceous...
it's silicate based.
Yeah, but there are lots of algae that have a calcareous shell. So they're the haptophytes, which include the coccolithophores. Often they have these calcareous liths or scales on them.
Okay.
And those are part of the algae too. So marine botany includes the microalgae and the macroalgae that are in the marine system, as well as all the marine vascular plants.
Okay.
So those include things like seagrasses, salt marsh plants, and mangroves.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay.
So all those that were, they invaded the green algae, are the ancestors to all terrestrial land plants. And so as the terrestrial land plants diversified, there was an invasion back into the marine system by a few small group of plants.
Right. But not many, right?
No, not many at all.
And I would imagine that they just cannot... I imagine there's a lot of habitats that are occupied by, and eco niches that are occupied by algae that can't be occupied by plants due to lack of light or temperature or salinity or things like that?
Yeah. So, as plants kind of diversified onto land, they grew into having these forms and functions of having a root system and a shoot system and vascularization for a whole number of them. And then when you try to take that type of form and you put it back in an aquatic system, those roots have a really hard time because they get waterlogged.
Yeah.
And so there's all these sort of innovations that those marine vascular plants have that many other terrestrial land plants don't have.
And talk to me a little bit about, I guess, those differences with algae where they are. And actually, just going back a second, I asked you just before we started recording, is it algae or algae? And you kind of give that explanation for folks too.
Sure. I'd say it depends. As long as you're consistent.
It's potato.
Exactly. So I think.
Although I don't know anybody who says potato. Well, I've heard one I heard one time was a triathlete from Britain, and she was saying that she had just had a banana. Anyway,
or like our house discussion last night over dinner was, is it caramel or caramel? The same thing like that. So I think most people in Europe sometimes call it algae, and also in Australia they say algae, and most people in North America, if you don't have Commonwealth lineage, you say algae.
Yeah, okay.
And it used to be that the study of algae was called algology. And it's been shifted to being called phycology.
I like that better.
Yeah, it was a mix-up of both Greek and Latin for algology.
Oh, okay.
And so if you take the strict Greek for that ology part of it, algology means the study of pain.
Oh yeah, okay,
Algos,
right.
So we shifted over. Some people in kind of past generations do call it algology.
So the word algae would be, or algae would be, like equivalent of saying plant and saying phyto, referring to plants, and phyco would be the phyto equivalent talking about plants. Is it kind of like that?
Sort of, although it kind of gets back to your original question of like, what are the algae? And when Micah said that, well, they're protists. They're not even just protists. So if you wanted to have a specific definition, it would almost be impossible. Because if you,
I want to dig into this for a second. Hang on, I want to drill down on this because I don't like when things don't fit in categories nicely.
Yes.
And I struggle with this. Okay, so, but yet I understand that these are anthropogenic categories,
totally,
right? So
absolutely.
And they work mostly, right?
No.
Okay, they don't work mostly. They do seem to work pretty good most of the time, right?
Yeah.
And then you get to where we're at the edges of where this thing works, right?
I would think so. I think that if anyone who's a phycologist fractures any sort of nice kind of classification scheme that you have been taught.
Okay, so let's do that then. So in my mind, it's been really simple. There's like, when I think about food, now I understand that there's currently 6 kingdoms of life, we say, right? I get very confused about things like we were talking today. There was a CWD case, chronic wasting disease, found in Quebec recently. So, and that's in cervids deer. That's a prion.
Okay.
And it's like, what is a prion? Yeah. Like, it's very confusing to, there's
it's
stuff
an
that doesn't
entity,
fit.
But it's not really a living
thing. It's like a protein, but it can do what, anyway. So I know there's these areas that don't fit, but in my mind, when it came to food, it was like, oh, well, people eat plants, people eat animals, people eat fungi, and people eat microbiota, yeasts and bacteria. But I'd never thought about, we eat protists. Then when I started looking into it, I'm like, wait a second, what are these protists? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, my current impression is it's just like a trash bin for stuff that doesn't fit.
I call it the garbage kingdom.
It really is.
It really is.
I don't like that.
Well, I think the idea was, it originally was just 5 kingdoms, right? So like if it was the Monera, the bacteria, it was the fungi, the plants, the animals, and then the category that nothing fit well in. You just shoved it into the protists. Okay. And that seemed to alleviate a lot of problems because most people didn't care about the protists because they weren't plants and they weren't animals and they weren't fungi,
right?
And they weren't bacteria.
And at that time, where was algae?
Was
it already there?
It was, and I think it was most relegated to the plants because I think people often think just plants, photosynthetic, beautiful, it fits. They're as one of these books out here, so ocean flowers. Right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
thinking of it as just being botanical in nature and nothing more.
But to add to the complexity, photosynthesis, correct me if I'm wrong, was learned from algae.
Yeah, so photosynthesis evolved from cyanobacteria.
Okay.
So which are prokaryotes, and they fit in the bacteria.
Okay.
So within the algae, you span actually
Okay.
3 of those kingdoms, because if you really want to lump
Yeah.
them all together, you've got the bacteria for the cyanobacteria, which are the original innovators of photosynthesis. And then you have the red algae and the green algae and the glaucophytes, which the green algae then were the ancestors for all terrestrial land plants.
Okay.
And traditionally, people kind of group those sometimes in the plants. And then you have the brown algae, the diatoms, the dinoflagellates, the apicomplexans, the haptophytes, the chloracneophytes, the euglenoids, and everything else that they were shoved into the protist kingdom. So in thinking about kind of our traditional view of how to categorize and classify all organisms, the algae don't fit neat
Yeah.
into that unless you put in a different lens. So if you have the lens of the theory of endosymbiosis, which is the acquisition, incorporation, and not digestion of a cyanobacterium or a red alga or a green alga that then became the plastid, the photosynthesizing organelle, it all makes sense.
Okay, that didn't make sense to me. So I want to go back to that. I feel like, to be a phycologist, it's like Alice in Wonderland.
Totally, you have to like just jump down the rabbit hole.
Let go of the rules. What was that? Okay, that thing you just said. Simplify that for me, or say that another way.
So the process is called endosymbiosis.
Endosymbiosis.
Yes.
So that's where that would be like us with our mitochondria.
Correct.
Okay, so for people listening, you have your own DNA, and then you have this other DNA in your mitochondria that's coming from it's matrilineal, right? And because we've at some point incorporated some bacteria into our cell structure that produces our energy, right?
Correct. Exactly.
Okay, so similarly, that's also kind of true of chloroplasts,
correct.
right?
Exactly.
So the thing that's producing energy in plant cells is also an endosymbiotic organism, or was at some point?
Correct. So all of the photosynthetic organisms have both mitochondria and chloroplasts.
Oh, they have mitochondria as well.
Yeah, they do.
So then they have 2 different
They have
symbionts.
2 alien things in them that they have
that's
incorporated,
cool.
and it's permanent. So it's a permanent relationship,
That's
and
so
it
neat.
passes on from parent to offspring. So you don't have to reacquire those plastids.
I always think like one of the, it's just an interesting, because obviously politically right now there's so much gender stuff going on, and one of the things I find fascinating that I wonder why it's not talked about more, because it seems so relevant right now, that male mitochondrial DNA is like ejected right out of the zygote or whatever.
Well,
and
the
that
sperm don't. It's not transferred. It's just the nucleus.
It's like not part of the zygote, right?
Yeah.
So then you only have all of your mitochondrial DNA goes back to the mitochondrial Eve, they say, like all the way back to the first woman.
Exactly.
That's really
I always tell my son,
fascinating,
you have more of me than you do of your father, because I gave you your mitochondria.
And then when you think about that, it's like that all energy production in the human body comes through the female line.
Correct.
It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
So,
but not always. So there's some interesting
geez.
exceptions to that too.
These psychologists.
That has not in the phycological realm. This is just a psychologist telling you.
Just like, I know, that's what I'm saying. Is, as a phycologist, you're like, well, your categories don't quite work. Let
I
me
know.
show
There's
you how.
always those exceptions to the rule.
Exceptions. Okay, so back to it then. You were saying that the key to understanding some of this is understanding the endosymbiosis. So I want to
Correct.
go back to that.
So a long time ago, cyanobacterium was engulfed and retained by some eukaryote that already had a mitochondria, and we call it a protist. So who knows what it really was. It was in the garbage kingdom, the protist. And it didn't digest that cyanobacterium, and it then became the plastid. It became the photosynthetic organelle.
Okay.
And that primary endosymbiotic event is thought to have occurred just once.
Endosymbiotic for people. Endo means within or
Yep.
internal, right? And symbiotic means like two organisms working together
Correct.
harmoniously for
Yep.
greater benefit. So to take in another organism into you and
Correct.
incorporate it,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it's different than what most people think of as other symbioses that are transient in nature, like
Right.
corals and dinoflagellates, or anemones and clownfish. Those get
Like
reestablished.
people and pet dogs.
Yeah, for sure. But and wouldn't it be cool to kind of acquire a cyanobacterial
Yeah.
cell into us and then never have
It's
to...
very science fiction sounding,
Very
and yet it's
much.
like our everyday reality. right?
Exactly. And so there are traces, signatures of this, of the chloroplast being this cyanobacterium that is enslaved to the eukaryotic protist. So it has its own DNA. It has its own replication process, so it's outside of the cell cycle, replicating itself.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and it looks just like a cyanobacterium.
Wow.
In terms of the photosynthetic pigments and its overall structure. So that primary endosymbiotic event gave rise to 3 algal lineages. It gave rise to the glaucophytes, which are very small. They're only found in some freshwater systems.
Okay. When you say small, do you mean like
Like
unicellular?
Yep,
or-
unicellular for the
Okay.
most part, and microscopic.
Okay.
And then gave rise to the green algal lineage
Okay.
and the red algal lineage.
Okay, that's good to know because I keep hearing about these different, the red and the greens, and I didn't know if this was morphological or if it had this deep of a.
Yeah, so it
genetic
does
story.
have a deep genetic story in terms of thinking about the overall the plastid structure for green algae and red algae is different as well. Then, as time went on, there were many secondary endosymbiotic lineages. So another eukaryotic protist came along, and it either engulfed and retained a red alga or engulfed and retained a green alga. And that gave rise to more algal lineages.
Oh, no
So if you
way.
think about kind of all of the protists and you had a phylogenetic tree or a visual representation
Right.
of those genetic and evolutionary relationships, it would look like someone scattered dice all across it. But it all makes sense in thinking about
Yeah.
endosymbiosis. So the brown algae, and so in thinking about seaweeds, they encompass the green algae, the red algae, and the brown algae. The brown algae are descendants from a secondary endosymbiotic acquisition of a red alga.
Okay.
So that's when I think people start to cringe when they
Yeah.
think about, you can't call kelp, which is a member of the brown algae, a plant, because plants derive from green algae. So it's basically so far removed evolutionarily that plant doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So, but it's hard to say like, well, actually, it's a secondary endosymbiotic lineage of a
Yeah,
red
yeah.
alga. That's the probably most important one to say.
How'd you end up here, and at what point in your life did interest in seaweeds emerge for you?
Pretty young. So I was 14 when I went to a summer camp on Mount Desert Island.
Okay.
I grew up outside the city of New York City.
All right.
And a lot of the students
You'd
who
come here for the summer?
just
or-
came. It was just a 2-week program.
Okay.
It was in Seal Harbor. Most of the students who were there were interested in sharks or whales or sea turtles, dolphins, and it was this afternoon of keying out the algae, the seaweeds that were there, that just captivated me.
It grabbed you.
Totally. And I think part of it was that they were these underdogs. They were beautiful,
Yeah.
absolutely stunning, and I knew nothing about them.
Yeah.
And no one else cared.
Yeah.
So I sort of adopted them when I was 14, and then ever since then I knew that I wanted to do something with algae.
And so you followed the marine biology pathway.
So I did. I followed the marine biology pathway. I went to Boston University for my undergraduate degree and was part of what was called the BUMP program. So it was the Boston University Marine Program. And I spent a semester in Woods Hole. And I was fortunate enough to take a symbiosis class with Lynn Margulis, who was one of the key people to bring that theory of endosymbiosis to the masses in the
interesting.
1970s. And then after I finished at BU, I went to the University of Maine to study with Dr. Susan Brawley. And her expertise was the reproductive ecology and she was interested in the population genetics of fucoid algae. So they're a group of brown algae that are dominant on rocky intertidal shores, all in the North Atlantic in temperate areas. And so I spent 5.5 years delving into looking at just the reproductive ecology and population genetics of one fucoid alga called Fucus vesiculosus. And then from there, just...
How much of that was field work? How much of that was lab work? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, so I had a number of field experiments long term. So we did 2 field seasons out at Squiddick Point in Acadia National Park and at Pemaquid Point. And what I was interested in, and kind of following up on Susan's kind of research themes at that time, was trying to fine-tune a model of when reproduction occurs for fucoid algae and Fucus vesiculosus in particular. So Fucus vesiculosus in general...
Does it have a common name that
people call it bladder rack?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, sure.
And its cousin is Ascophyllum nodosum,
right.
or people call like knotted rack.
Yeah. Okay.
And so Fucus is not commercially as important as Ascophyllum in the state of Maine, but people do harvest it for...
We're talking about bladderwrack and rockweed.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
But the rockweeds include all the fucoid algae.
Okay.
So there's a whole bunch of...
Okay, so technically the lay term rockweed is a umbrella term that
Correct.
refers to all of these rocky coast intertidal...
Brown algae.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But in common parlance now, there's the distinction of these two terms, rockweed and rockweed is
Ascophyllum.
Ascophyllum.
Yeah.
This is the one that's got such economic importance and is so politically
correct. There's a lot of layers to it. Yeah.
Yep. And then with the bladderwrack, which also falls under this term rockweed.
They're also rockweeds too.
Okay, but I often hear them used differently.
But they're sort of a cousin to them.
Okay.
So they're often smaller in stature, but they're just as incredible. So Fucus vesiculosus has separate male and female individuals.
Okay.
And their life history or their life cycle is very much like a human being. So they have what's called a diploid life history. So the only what you're going to see in the field is a diploid individual.
What's a diploid? For people?
Has 2 copies of every chromosome. So it's inherited a copy from the mother and from the father. And it produces the females. So they're separate female individuals, and they produce eggs, and they're separate male individuals, and they produce sperm. And they're often found, they grow in these reproductive organs at the tips of the individuals, and they're filled with mucilage. And oftentimes, when people are on the shore, they love to pop them,
those,
and they smear them all over their face, or they're playing with them. And then you say, like, those are eggs and sperm, and you're just like smearing it all over. And it kind of, mostly middle school kids get totally freaked out by that.
I've eaten a lot of
that. It is really good for your skin, though, right?
It's very hydrating, and there are a lot of antioxidants found within them. So, like, go ahead and smear away.
Yeah, smear.
And so, what Susan's lab, past graduate students and herself had found was that Fucus vesiculosus has nearly 100% fertilization success. Wow. So it releases eggs and sperm into the water column, and every single egg all those eggs get fertilized by sperm, which is...
Can I a quick question? And I don't want to take you off track here. So the last thing I'll just anchor in. We're talking about 100% fertilization, but some of the algae reproduce with spore.
Yeah.
And some, now you're telling me this one, egg and sperm, so a different reproductive strategy altogether? Or
Correct.
Are these the same thing we're talking about?
Well, so most of the algae need to have an aqueous phase and be in water for some part of their life history. And often that has to do with reproduction. And so most, but not all algae have some sort of flagellated propagule that moves around.
Okay, flagellated propagule means that it has some kind of tail that gives it motility?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. But within the algae, and if we just want to, I know it gets, so complicated.
I like it. I only stop you to, I just want to, every time you say something like that,
totally
simplify it just
Absolutely.
To make sure I'm getting
Those
it.
vocabulary words just come.
But I like them, yeah.
And so when some sort of entity has a flagellum, it's able to move. And so oftentimes let me backtrack. within the algae, there are lots of different ways that reproduction takes place. And for the most part, within the algae, they've got the widest diversity of reproductive strategies and the most complicated reproductive strategies. So if people are interested in reproductive ecology, they should become phycologists because it's more complicated than most terrestrial land plants.
Okay.
And
Just this idea of a flagellum to me, I mean, like with like, let's say mammalian sperm, I'm not shocked by its motility because it's comes from an animal that has motility, so it makes sense to me. The idea that there's a flagellum on an algae is weird to me because I associate that kind of motility with animals. That ability to propel oneself through the environment I think of algae as being passive. So I'm a little, are there plants with flagellum? I mean,
well, so plants, when the green algae then invaded the land and then started to evolve into terrestrial land plants, the problem was that it was a dry environment.
Right.
And so flagella wouldn't really fly
work.
there.
Right.
So there were then these steps evolutionarily in terms of kind of started off being spores, and then seeds and pollen were these innovations that allowed for things no longer to be flagellated.
Understood.
But for the most part, most algal reproductive gamete is flagellated.
Is that flagellum is that a organelle, or is it made of multiple cells?
Yeah, so it's neither. So it's not.
Of course, that's going to be the answer.
Phycology hurts my head.
So it's made up of microtubules.
Yeah.
And thinking about cytoskeletal elements. So it's not really an organelle.
But is this thing we're talking about is it one cell? The whole.
So yeah. So it's anchored to a cell.
Okay.
So and there's a lot of complexity in terms of thinking.
But is it extracellular?
It's not extracellular because it's literally anchored inside the cell.
Okay.
And for many, all red algae, I'm going to make it complicated a little bit more.
Yeah.
All red algae have lost a flagellated life history stage.
Okay.
So we're going to move red algae aside.
They do not have flagellum.
They don't have flagella, and that's crazy. And I'll tell you why in a second.
Right.
But for, let's say, the green algae, they have multiple flagella. So having a singular flagellum is pretty unusual for green algae. They usually have 2, 4, 8 flagella.
Wow.
Within the brown algae, there are lots of groups that they're called heterocont, and they've got 2 flagella that look very different from each other. So one is highly ornamented, and it's got all these hairs on it, and one of them is smooth. And so the arrangement.
They have different functions.
They do have different functions in terms of swimming and being able, and then also having a lot of chemical signaling on them so that they're going to be able to find.
So that's my next question is, how do they navigate and find?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that was sort of one of these themes of Susan's research at UMaine and before that where she was working. And so to get 100% fertilization success for something that has external reproduction. So one of the things that you mentioned in terms of thinking about animals is most animals have internal fertilization, or they have and don't have as much or not all animals, like corals have external fertilization. In the animal world, we call that broadcast spawning.
Yeah, right.
Just like, release your eggs and sperm or whatever reproductive cells you have into the environment, and you cross your fingers that they're going to find each other.
Right.
And what we have found is that there are often very, very strict cues that those animals use to allow for those eggs and sperm to find each other. So they're trained with light, they're trained with lunar cues. On coral reefs, there are particular times during the night that corals are going to be reproductive. And so it's, one species of coral is going to be reproducing from 2:30 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. And that's it. And then the next species of coral, so that they don't.
This is phenology, is what you're talking about here?
Kind of like the timing of reproduction and seasonality. So it is part of phenology, correct. But it's more so kind of these like really what we call proximate cues, these like really tight cues. And so within Fucus...
That's coordinating the dance of these sperm and egg to find one another.
Exactly.
Okay.
And usually what we think of as a three-dimensional environment. So in thinking about in the water, you just broadcast spawn and then hope things find each other. There's lots of chemicals in the environment too. So often eggs are producing chemicals called pheromones that make their target size much bigger. And so sperm are able to smell those eggs and find them.
Unbelievable.
But for Fucus vesiculosus, it has these separate male and female individuals. It's about 50% female and male in the field in the North Atlantic. It's different in different places. And so they only reproduce during slack high tide when it's sunny and it's calm.
Oh, wow.
So this is
very particular.
Very particular, but they achieve 100% fertilization
I was going to say,
success.
exactly, but they've got it down.
Right?
Yes.
The mood needs to be right.
Totally. But it has no brain, and it's a very simple looking organism. So it's pretty amazing that this organism has been able to achieve this reproductive ecology. So that was part of my research for my dissertation, was trying to figure out ratcheting down those environmental cues. So like, how sunny does it have to be? How much calmness or water motion can there be?
Right.
And kind of come up with a model for kind of refining a model for reproduction for Fucus vesiculosus. And then also, because they have these really tight, calm, sunny conditions on a coastal promontory like Schoodic or Pemaquid, there could be really different conditions on either side of those coastal points. So if you had the wind coming in from the east, you would have kind of the eastern shore of that peninsula have lots of water motion, where on the western shore, it would have this buffering and it could be really calm. So over time, there might be genetic differences between east and west side individuals. And so that was the other part of my research that was mostly lab-based, was to fingerprint them and figure out if there were genetic differences within small geographic areas and then really large geographic areas.
Okay.
So I sampled from everywhere from North Carolina all the way up to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and thinking about that distribution of where Fucus vesiculosus is. Because the last glacial maximum, everything north of Long Island Sound was extirpated because it was underneath the glaciers and then had to be recolonized. So we were looking for...
So in other words, from Long Island north, all of that Fucus is fairly recent. When we talk about the last glacial maximum, how long ago was that?
About 18,000 years ago.
Not that long.
That's
long. Very recent.
But 18,000 years ago, we were under 2 miles of ice.
Yeah.
So all of that rocky intertidal shore that we have now is really recent in terms of thinking about those populations that had to be reestablished after that shore became available.
Right. So what did you find in sampling?
So I found a lot of things. I found that sunny, calm conditions, again, allowed for there to be 100% fertilization success. And Susan's group beforehand had been able to show that how they're able to achieve that is they link reproduction to photosynthesis.
Okay.
So when it's sunny and calm,
they get maximum photosynthesis.
Well, so when it's sunny and calm and it's photosynthetic, it has to take up carbon dioxide for its carbon source to fix into sugars. And in the water, it's bicarbonate that's the dominant carbon source. So they're taking up bicarbonate, and it's all around the thallus or the body of that alga. And so when it's sunny, they're going to be photosynthesizing. They're just going to be chugging and taking up all that bicarbonate. And after about 2 hours after slack high tide, when the water is the calmest, typically, they reach photosynthetic saturation, and they don't take up any more. And if it's calm, there's no more bicarbonate right around the body of the alga, and that's the trigger. If it's sunny, but there's water motion, it keeps replenishing the bicarbonate around the body of the alga, and so it can keep photosynthesizing.
Yeah.
But that sunny, calm condition of linking reproduction to photosynthetic capacity is incredible. And the eggs are negatively buoyant, so they start to sink in the water column. And the sperm, if you ever were smearing it on your face and you took a look at the color, they're bright orange. They look like a tang orange.
Okay.
And it's because they have an eye spot. And so they're phototactic. They're able to respond to light, and they're negatively phototactic. So they swim down. So instead of having these...
They swim away from the light.
They swim away from the light. So if you've got these eggs that are falling and you've got these sperm that are swimming down, they're no longer having to find each other in a three-dimensional volume.
Yeah.
The reproduction's occurring right on the bottom.
On the bottom. Wow.
How far do they travel?
Yeah, so good question. They don't travel very far. So there could be some kind of microcurrents that could move them. Sperm are really itty bitty, so they're about 10 microns in size. We can't see them without a microscope. The eggs are between 60 and 80 microns in size, so you could see them. But it's thought that they don't disperse more than maybe a meter or so in terms of like 90% of that kind of shadow of where they end up. But what I found in the genetics of Fucus vesiculosus is that there isn't, that there is a lot of genetic connectivity, that there is not this kind of strict kind of isolation.
Isolated populations.
No. And so where that connectivity and that gene flow is occurring is storm detached, rafting, reproductive material. So when in the reproductive season for Fucus vesiculosus, which is typically September to December, it's hurricane season. We've got lots of storms on the coast, and it detaches reproductive material, and it can raft sometimes kilometers away,
right,
and still reproduce.
Because so much of this is happening.
Exactly.
They're genetically intermixed.
Exactly.
Wow, it's a little early in the conversation for me to ask you this, but I'm gonna. Hey, we'll get right back to the show, but I wanted to take a moment to tell you how you can see season 1 of WildFed. If you head over to wild-fed.com right now, you'll see that pre-orders for Season 1 are available alongside the Season 1 experience. Both will begin on January 6th of 2020. If you choose the show on its own, you'll get access to a new episode every week for 8 weeks. Remember, these are 30-minute episodes, not the 22 minutes of a typical TV show. If you choose the program, it'll include Season 1, but each week, along with a new episode, you'll receive a director's cut, where our producer Grant Giuliano and I break down the episode, discussing the background, the gear we use, the places and people and stories involved, as well as some of the comedy that took place on the side, some of the drama, some of the intrigue that we couldn't squeeze into the 30-minute format. You'll also get exclusive access to a weekly live Q&A, where we'll be answering your questions and discussing how you can get started hunting, fishing, and foraging for food. Additionally, this will all take place inside of a private member group where you'll have access to me and the WildFed team for a full 9 weeks, as well as a community of like-minded folks. If you just want to see the show on its own, it's $49. If you want to join me in the 9-week program, that's just $249. Go over to wild-fed.com to get the show or sign up for the program. Now, here's the rest of the podcast. As a scientist, but also as like a human being, how do you reconcile the apparent intelligence, especially when you go like, okay, there's no brain or central nervous system, and yet there's like this deep intelligence that's like so perceptible, right? Or at least when you think about it, it's so complex that it's like staggering, right? So how do you like...
Yeah, I don't think of it as intelligence other than kind of...
What would be a word for it for you?
Marvel at the ingenuity of natural selection.
Okay. And sexual selection,
yeah,
though, right? It's like
exactly,
both forces.
Exactly. And so, that organisms that live in very complex habitats, and especially in kind of a marine setting where it's really highly stressful, have evolved all these different adaptations to be able to be highly successful. And that to me is marvelous. Like I marvel at it. I don't think of it as being kind of this intellect that they have, but that just over time all those adaptations have arisen to allow them to be so great at what they do.
Yeah, it's just incredible. It's like hard for me to get my head around. In your career, no doubt, I would assume at least, that you have witnessed the coming out of seaweeds into the public arena.
Yes.
And that must have been really interesting to watch, because it's gone from sort of something very obscure to something that now is being talked about constantly.
Totally.
What's that been like, and can you describe a little bit like that process, how it's unfolded culturally?
Yeah, it's sort of been like the shunned child who now like finally gets like a little bit more like, oh yeah, what you do is mighty interesting. I think of it most as since I've started teaching here. So this is my 12th year teaching here at Maine Maritime Academy. And my first year, I think all the students had no idea what I was talking about. And when I tried to present them eating different seaweeds or eating different algae, because we eat macroalgae too, they were not interested. They looked at me like I was crazy, and they would never put something of that nature into their mouth and swallow.
It's like slimy. It
Totally.
secretes mucilage.
And I think that kind of evolution in 12 years is remarkable. I kind of think about kale being sort of this gateway towards drinking things that are green.
Yeah.
So having more bitter foods in our Western palate, and so that has been kind of this slow market. So I feel like when kale became a superfood, the opening for eating seaweeds just cracked open a little bit more. Yeah. But people have been eating seaweeds for such a long time.
I think seaweed's more pleasant than kale.
I do too.
Yeah, I'll eat alaria over kale
any day.
I think it's way more delicious and a little bit more healthy too.
Yeah.
So I think since people have started to aquaculture it, and kind of cultivate seaweeds in the state too, that has been given a little bit more interest for people. Yeah. And I think in the last 12 years, people are more conscious of what they're consuming, and that local food movement has also become much more important when people are choosing what they're eating and where they're getting it from.
Yeah, and it's funny to me to hear kind of salty old lobstermen talking about, now that we have this kelp aquaculture starting to unfold here, it's funny to hear them talking about kelp. I don't know why, it just amuses me a little bit because it seems so out of character.
Yeah,
you know?
Totally.
But the idea of these like growing things. But I want to also, you teach a course that involves or at least touches on the ethnobotany, which actually would be ethnophycology, would it not? Okay.
Yeah.
But we'll call it ethnobotany, which I'm not sure if I understand that completely, but it indicates to me talking about traditional use amongst, people.
In different cultures.
Yeah.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I do touch on it in terms of thinking about traditional uses for seaweeds. More seaweeds than I would say for the macroalgae in different cultures, because it is very important. So in the Hawaiian Islands, people have historically eaten seaweeds, and it was actually only transferred to from mother to daughter or grandmother to granddaughter, and it was an oral tradition. And people would go out and they'd harvest the seaweeds and
stormcast, or they'd go cut.
They would go and they would harvest, not stormcast, and then they would actually often ferment them.
Oh, neat.
And they had kind of different phenologies in terms of time during the year where they would harvest different seaweeds and they'd consume it. But Hawaii is, that archipelago is this melting pot for lots of different Asian cultures, and so the traditions kind of faded away, and with different Asian cultures kind of inhabiting Hawaii, those native seaweeds became less and less apparent in markets, so that people kind of no longer ate them, and they ate kind of the kind of standard seaweeds that most people eat in terms of thinking about porphyra or nori or wakame and or kombu, and they kind of disregarded those more traditional foods. And same thing in terms of thinking about First Nations in North America. They would traditionally go and harvest seaweeds and eat them. And even in...
We know that from ethnographic reports or from archaeological sites, or like how
mostly
do we know?
Ethnographic.
Yeah.
Archaeologically, lots of seaweeds they don't leave any kind of substance or material in terms of being in the record. And then also just in thinking about North America and our recent immigration here from Europe, for lots of people traditionally in Ireland and Scotland and England and France would eat seaweeds. And it would be a very important part of their lifestyle. And then when they moved toward North America, they kind of abandoned that. That was sort of a poor person's way to forage. And so I feed them kind of traditional Irish foods that people would have made in Ireland centuries ago and really gotten a lot of nutrition from. That kind of people who have Irish descent in North America probably had never eaten before.
Yeah, right. So now there's sort of this resurgence, right? So it's sort of coming back. And, and not, I would imagine there's the direct culinary, but then there's there's the food additive side too, right? Which must be huge. And then I imagine we're seeing, I would just guess that there's a tremendous amount of industrial application as well. What kind of ways are seaweeds showing up in things?
Lots of different ways. So I have a whole bunch of stuff here. And so not just in terms of thinking about culinary, but also cosmetic. So the seaweeds traditionally too have been used to remedy lots of skin diseases or skin conditions. They're very hydrating. They have different types of compounds that people seek out, like hyaluronic acid, to kind of help with skin tonicity and everything. And so both in terms of cosmetic use, this is a particular product that I got from Ireland, and it's just bulk.
Oh, it's like a seaweed bath.
It's just a seaweed bath. It's just a bag of dried seaweed that you just stick in the bathtub.
In the hot water.
In the hot water.
Drawing out that.
Exactly. And so lots of seaweeds have a lot of mucilage in them that basically makes the water hydrating and very viscous. And then it kind of seeps in. It has lots of trace minerals that you can...
Like a mix of different seaweeds or one specific kind?
That looked like it was one species.
That one is one specific kind. It's a type of fucus that we don't have we don't have in the U.S. called Fucus serratus. But sometimes, you can get like just a whole bag of different seaweeds and kind of put it in. And then the kind of the nutritional supplements. So there's equine supplements, there's canine supplements, and then there's human supplements that you can take that have all these trace minerals and vitamins that are in seaweeds highly concentrated. So you don't need to have a whole lot of that material to be able to have those benefits.
One message I keep hearing again and again is that it's small amounts regularly versus large amounts infrequently.
Totally, yeah. So like, don't binge. Like small amounts, and we see that too. One of the products that comes from the rockweed harvest is an extract. So you take rockweed and you extract out these compounds that are still not quite yet characterized, but in very dilute amounts. It has tremendous applications for agriculture. So you can spray it as a foliar spray on potatoes or grapes or tomatoes, and you get increased fruit production. You've got decreased...
we don't know why yet.
No. So they have kind of hormone-like properties.
Interesting.
But they're not...
it's not just that it's nutrition; it's that it's actually
stimulating
something.
It's helping the plant, and it's also thought to also help with fungal disease, of not allowing for them to have as many insecticides or fungicides also applied. Right. So it has lots of different applications. Some seaweeds have this mucilage, or what we call these phycocolloids inside the thallus or the body of the alga, and you can extract those out. And so traditionally that's agar or carrageenan.
Yep, these are like thickening agents.
Exactly. Or for the brown algae, there's the alginates. And those kind of they have a huge variety of applications to keep things emulsified, to make things smooth and creamy.
How about, and this might be outside of your wheelhouse, how about as a chelating agent? There was a lot of talk about seaweed extracts being used at Chernobyl when people have accumulated, radionucleodes or whatever. Is there anything you know about that?
It's totally out of my wheelhouse in terms of thinking about, but it's the iodine that's in...
Is one aspect.
Is one aspect,
right.
Yeah. Lots of seaweeds are used for like bioremediation, and that's not my specialty.
Yeah.
But they're very good at absorbing heavy metals, absorbing different compounds that people don't want to have, and they can then concentrate them, and you can then remove that algae and compost it, incinerate it, do something with it, and get it out of the environment.
Right. And then also, like you were just mentioning with the iodine, obviously that's a trace mineral lost to a lot of our soils at this point, right? So it's a way of sort of keeping the thyroid happy and getting the iodine we need. Do you have an opinion on or an educated guess on what's going to happen with carrageenan? Because it seems like it's currently vilified. It's unclear to me if it's, there's all this talk about whether or not it's should be included in organics and et cetera. Any ideas there?
I would say my expertise is kind of not that phycological chemistry side of it, but I guess my opinion on it personally is like anything that you can hyper process. Yeah. So if you take a carrageenan bearing seaweed like Chondrus crispus, which is the native seaweed that has carrageenan.
That's our Irish moss.
Exactly. And you boil it, you extract out that carrageenan into the water, or if you put that Irish moss into milk, and you can make a pudding. You're not going to have complications in terms of...
That's like a crude extract.
Yeah, it's a crude extract.
Isolating
exactly.
the molecule.
And so for that refinement of taking that carrageenan and then modifying it for specific industrial applications, there are all these other processes of acidifying it or adding different chemical compounds to it to get the specific application that the end user wants.
Right.
I think of that as anything like what we do with sugars.
Yeah. We're getting too refined.
So like sugar cane's not that bad, but if you keep refining the sugar, you're going to be modifying it so that it might not have a biological analog.
I chewed a lot of coca down in Peru, but
so
hitting bumps of cocaine is probably not the best.
It's probably too processed. And so I think for carrageenan, it's very much similar to that. Is anytime you hyper process something, you're going to maybe have negative consequences for natural digestion. Yeah.
For the person listening to this show whose interest might be in the foraging side and the food application, I'm curious, like, where you kind of point people who don't have any experience with this and are interested in learning more about sustainably becoming part of that ecological niche, where they're going to eat from it, but also don't want to damage it. And it's such a big world. And I think from the beginning of this interview, the first thing that's obvious to people is like, whoa, this is way more complicated than I realized, right?
Yeah.
So how do you kind of get lay people? I'm sure you have a lot of experience with this with friends and family whose interest isn't going deep into the science, but are sort of curious about
something. I would say if someone is really nervous to start, to already buy material that has been harvested by reputable companies. Yeah. So having Micah's company or Maine Coast Sea Vegetables or Vitamin C, there's lots of companies that already go out and they harvest, and that they are all part of the Maine Seaweed Council, which promotes sustainable harvest and management of our fishery of seaweed harvesting. And so that would be the first place, that if you're nervous about harvesting, don't harvest yourself. Collect, find and buy material that has already been harvested so that you get used to the different tastes and textures, because all seaweed doesn't taste the same. And when you start working with it, it's going to be different depending on what you're going to do with it. The second thing, if someone feels like they want to go out and forage, because I think it's really nice to be able to see that there are so many different varieties of seaweed that are on our shores, and that they are delicious and you can harvest, and
then it can be very meaningful to, like, it's nice to eat something that you've purchased from somebody who was conscientious in gathering it, and then there's that deeper level of connection that you get when you see that organism in its place and you get to work with it too, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I think the thing I would recommend next is, if you wanted to go out and forage, to understand each different species that you're trying to forage for, because they're all not the same. And so oftentimes I would bring out snips, like bring out a pair of scissors or shears, and not take the whole individual. Yeah. So that's really important, because for lots of things that are blade-like, if you cut off part of it and you leave part of the blade still there, it can regenerate. So you're basically...
Because we're not talking about a vascular plant here where you're because the whole blade absorbs from the environment.
It gets all the nutrition from
so
that
it can
environment.
it can be broken in half and it still functions, whereas with a vascular plant, like if we cut it in half, we've now interrupted its ability to move.
The only exception to that is the kelps. And I think a lot of people who might be going out and foraging are interested in kelps because I think when people think seaweeds, they think kelps.
Sure.
So one mantra is, all kelps are seaweeds, but not all seaweeds are kelps.
Yeah.
Because people like to say, that's a kelp, and it's like a red alga, and it's very far removed from a kelp. But for kelps, they're attached to the rocks with a holdfast, and then they often have what's called a stipe, but kind of the analog for a plant would be like a stem, and then they've got their blade.
Oh, I have a question for you. I was asking Mike about this; he wasn't sure. You've got the holdfast, and then the stipe. Now, like if I was talking about a plant analog, I would say like the petiole of a leaf, right? Where you have, that will run right up through the center. Is it still the stipe running up through the center of the kelp frond? Or does it end where the blade begins?
Yeah, so some like Alaria, or the horsetail kelp, no, is it horsetail? I think so. As a common name, it has a midrib that kind of goes all the way up.
That's my question. Is that midrib the stipe, or does the stipe... Because it's obviously a continuous structure when you look at it.
Yeah, exactly. I would say, I don't really know anatomically. If you looked at the cells and you had them in terms of thinking about the differentiation. But regardless, in thinking about kelps, where their growth is, where they're growing, is that they don't grow from the tips up. Like lots of seaweeds do grow from the tips up, or they have what's called diffuse growth, like those blades. They just kind of all grow in every direction. For kelps, they have what's called intercalary growth. So you've got the holdfast, you've got the stipe, and then you've got the blade. And right at that center, kind of, there's a zone between the stipe and the blade, and that's where the new growth is.
Yeah.
So as long as you take the blade from above that new growth up, it'll keep growing. So
if you cut that
if you think like, I'm going to just cut that stipe, and I've left part of that kelp there, and it can grow back.
So even though you've left the holdfast.
You've left the holdfast, and you've left that
Because a lot of the
stipe.
Seaweeds, if you leave the holdfast, it will regenerate. So with the kelps, that is not the case.
That's not the case.
That's like a good pro tip right there. It's like good
yeah,
because
you could just basically decimate a kelp bed by just cutting it off and not leaving the newest tissue where it's going to be growing.
Right.
So that's sort of the second. If you want to forage, just know the growth pattern of the seaweeds that you're harvesting. And then also know where things are not polluted. So there's lots of seaweeds that grow when there's high nutrients, but there could also be lots of pollutants. So,
which, when you're dealing with an organism that can be used in remediation efforts, often it's because they tend to take up pollution.
Yeah.
Right?
So if I wouldn't go out to a polluted harbor and collect some seaweed there and then bring it home and eat it, I would want to have a pristine environment that you don't see a lot of pollutants around.
Yeah. What about, this is just sort of a little aside, but I'm curious how, and it might be hard for you to say quickly, but how are you feeling about the rockweed harvest in Maine? Do you think this is something that can be done sustainably? Do you think that we need to have tremendous changes in how it's taking place? I guess just how do you feel about the whole issue that's going on here? And maybe you could quickly summarize what the issue is too for people.
Sure. So rockweed, which is Ascophyllum nosum, so it's a type of fucoid algae. It's dominant on rocky intertidal shores. Has been harvested for over 40 years in the state of Maine by lots of individuals, and has lots of applications. And
might be people, I know people put it in their garden.
Yep. So
we use it in lobster bakes all the time.
Yeah. So people often use the storm detached material to add onto their garden as soil amendments. Some people allow their livestock to forage on that rafting material as well. It's really great for livestock. And then for the harvest, and people actually, they go out and they harvest, and they often use it for packing bait, or for lobster bakes, or for shipping material, because it keeps things hydrated.
Boy, is it hydroscopic too. I've got some I've got that rockweed from that big, we had a lobster bake at my wedding. And so there's a bunch of material in my compost right now. And I walked out there yesterday, and all this vegetable material is all dry, and this stuff is just sucked up all the atmospheric water.
Yep, it is. It's super hydrating.
Yeah. You noticed on humid, like you have some inside too, right?
Yeah,
on humid days it gets
just pulls moisture.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And the cool thing too is that it, in the dead of winter, it won't freeze. So it has antifreeze in it. It's got the sugar
It's
called...
not just the salts. It's
No,
also...
it's a mannitol that has
Right.
it. And so it basically...
Oh, it's a sugar.
It's a sugar
Yeah.
that allows for it to remain flexible. So it's not going to break.
Okay.
It's perennial. It's
All
able to
right.
be
And then
totally successful in the middle of winter.
Thinking too of like when I go smelting in the winter at the smelt camps and they bring you out the bloodworms as bait and they have them in a paper towel with a little bit of rockweed
Yeah.
that is there to, I imagine, keep moisture so they
keep
don't
everything
dry out.
hydrated. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So there's lots of kind of those small uses that I think that the rockweed industry, it's separate from the rockweed industry because it's often one or two individuals or a co-op that's kind of collecting that
Right.
seaweed, and that is not managed in any way, shape, or form. And it's not potentially sustainable if everyone goes and wants to harvest their own rockweed for that application, because oftentimes people are just like yanking those individuals
of
up.
course.
Whereas when you harvest rockweed for industry, the Department of Marine Resources in Maine has regulations for it.
Fairly new ones though, right?
In the 2000s,
Yeah.
and then there has been in about 5 years ago the rockweed fisheries management plan that was developed, but is on hold until this pending court case is complete in terms of
The
implementation.
industry is based mainly for fertilizer?
No, so the industry is kind of that soil amendments, those extracts, the supplements, and sometimes for fertilizer. But for the most part, it's not just fertilizer and supplements. It's all those value-added products too. And so a number of people are concerned in terms of rockweed harvest, in terms of it being sustainable, also in terms of thinking about property rights. And so
It's real complex.
so it's it's this multifaceted a dilemma or issue in terms of thinking about rockweed harvest. From my standpoint as a phycologist and thinking about Ascophyllum itself as a particular alga, the way in which it's harvested, that's managed, is sustainable. So that particular alga grows from the tip up, and when it's reproductive, it has these reproductive organs, and it's across the entire thallus of the plant or of the individual. And so
that's the blade.
That's the blade, or the frond. I call it the frond is a good way to say it. And so when you harvest seaweed, and you harvest rockweed, you're supposed to leave 16 inches. And it's an average because oftentimes how it's being harvested in the water,
Really
no, you
measure
can't
that,
be
yeah.
like, oh yeah, I'm going to go out and spend all my time measuring 16 inches.
Yeah.
And it was an arbitrary length when it was first developed. And so there are some countries that have shorter lengths and some that have longer lengths. And so you harvest and you leave 16 inches left from the holdfast to the top of the frond. And so in thinking about that, when you cut rockweed, it's stimulating lots of different disturbance that particular alga will experience through wave action or ice scour or movement in the water. And so there's lots of natural disturbance that removes large pieces of those fronds naturally.
In other words, the harvest is similar to things that happen.
In my perspective, the harvest is dwarfed by natural disturbance.
Oh, okay, understood.
So natural disturbance is
At least
way
at present,
bigger.
At least at present use. or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
And then what happens too when you harvest is that you stimulate growth.
Mm-hmm.
So the alga has a wound and it responds and actually stimulates more growth. So that if you go back and you measure how much it's grown after harvest,
Right.
it might be growing faster than an unharvested
Right.
rock-
Yeah, we find that with a
rockweed.
lot of plant foraging. One of the interesting ethnobotanical pieces of a lot of the foraging that was done by First Nations people here is that led to more productive environments when done properly.
Yep.
So I always think that's an interesting thing when you can find the techniques that stimulate more growth
Exactly.
and more production.
So, and the other part in thinking about, so I think that it is. I think it is stimulating growth, and it's not, and so it actually could increase growth rates and biomass over time. You're not taking the whole organism. So unlike most other fisheries, you take the whole organism, like you take the whole fish, you take the whole urchin, you take everything.
Right.
And here you're leaving
Yeah.
like a huge amount of biomass.
Yeah.
And you're still allowing it to be reproductive.
Okay.
Because those reproductive organs are not just on the tips. So they're all over.
Do you feel that because something that Susan Shetterly talked about, and I know that she's not a phycologist, right? She's a writer, but she was sort of talking about when you're harvesting fish, you're harvesting urchins, that you're taking the organisms. She sort of was talking about when you're taking seaweeds, she was referring to it as you're actually taking the habitat itself. So I'm curious about that part, because removing pieces is removing some portion of the, and I'm sounding like I'm somebody who goes out and harvests seaweed, so I'm not trying to I'm playing devil's advocate here, because I'm really trying to dig in. Is this an okay thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely.
At the levels we're doing it. But yeah, like this is habitat that other organisms do inhabit.
Correct. And I think that's also one of those unique aspects that rockweed has too. So most other organisms that are fished are not foundational habitats.
Right.
So this is an organism that's both an organism and a habitat. And so that's really unique in thinking about how to manage it, because there's not that many other things in the marine system that are that way.
Yeah.
And the short answer to that is we don't know.
Right.
And so there's, I collaborate with two researchers at the University of Maine who were looking at the effect of rockweed harvest on invertebrate and bird species.
Okay.
So the idea is that, when you remove that habitat, are you removing critical invertebrate species that are inhabiting that rockweed canopy, or decreasing the amount of shelter that they will have because that canopy is no longer there, as well as birds that might be foraging either at low tide or at high tide or at intertides that might be foraging on those invertebrate species or utilizing that rockweed as a habitat in some way. And so this is our first year of that project.
Oh, okay. Wow, yeah.
And so there'll be, and it's a really nice project that has stakeholders from the conservation and stakeholder groups, from the bird community, from the kind of general ecology community, and from the rockweed industry. So it's a neat project to really kind of suss out those exact questions in terms of what is the effect of the habitat and those organisms that rely on that habitat in harvested and unharvested plots.
So we're kind of like, everything's sort of like an unknown. And because these things have burst into the scene economically and as an ingredient and as an additive, it's all sort of undetermined. And
and in some ways too, you can't think about rockweed as just this like one gigantic blanket across the coast. So there are different populations of Ascophyllum in lots of different places, and there could be areas that are really much more productive than other areas, and there could be areas that respond differently to harvest. Let's say down East Maine than Southern Maine.
Do you feel confident that Maine is going to figure this thing out effectively? Like, do you feel confident that, okay, I guess the fear that I feel from people is that, oh, those Canadians are going to come down here and take all our rockweed or whatever. But the bigger concern being like the potential for creating sort of collapse scenarios. And do you feel confident that Maine is going to find good regulation around this?
I think that the rockweed fisheries management plan that was developed is very sound.
Is good, yeah.
And
that's good to hear.
It is taking kind of an ecosystems-based approach to management, and built into that management plan was continuous monitoring and revision. So
because we just got it wrong in so many fisheries in the past.
Yeah,
right?
But like I said before, rockweed is different in how it is harvested. I don't think that you can always have bad apples in a bunch. And you could have a harvester who just does not know how to harvest rockweed and takes the whole individual, and that's not sustainable.
But that's small scale regional. That's not
totally
right,
exactly. And so I think sometimes. Since human beings have not had such a great track record of sustainably harvesting and managing any natural resource, there is a fear, and sometimes that's being channeled to rockweed as being like the case. Like we should not get it wrong for rockweed.
Yeah, okay, right.
But rockweed's really different than all those other fisheries, and so I'm in thinking about the rockweed industry and those stakeholders, they're very conscientious.
Yeah.
And if they destroy their organism, then they're out of business.
Yeah.
And so I think for many of them, they have been harvesting rockweed sustainably with conscience for decades. And so they want to do it right too.
Yeah. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the aquaculture of seaweeds now? Do you feel this is like obviously it's like seems to me like it's got so much momentum now. This is a thing that's going to explode here on the coast. You think it's a good thing? Think it's a bad thing? Think it's we don't know? Or?
I think it's a great thing.
Cool.
I think that there is a lot of demand for seaweeds, or how we like to rebrand them, sea vegetables, and that having them be cultured provides a great added crop for lots of fisher people who don't have a lot to do during different seasons. And oftentimes when seaweeds are going to be having the highest growth and being able to be harvested is in the off season for them.
Yeah.
So that, most of it's a winter crop.
Yeah.
And so that you're not going to be having seaweed aquaculture impede navigation,
right?
Because there's not a lot of summer people who are around in the winter who are going to be needing their vessels out.
So it fits nicely into the current fishing package.
I think it complements a lot of the marine economy that's already here.
Yeah.
And then I think that there's this untapped use for seaweeds and sea vegetables, that there are all these products that have yet to be made that are delicious or nutritious, or have all these applications that for people who are entrepreneurs, if you have cultivated seaweeds, you're not then putting stress on wild harvested populations. And you could innovate lots of things.
Yeah, that's one of those interesting. We ask a question a lot of times to people who fish, who are involved in the commercial fisheries, especially in regulation. It's like I always ask this question: like, if you had a magic button that you could push, that would like end all sales of wild organisms, like would you push it? So I would ask you that question quickly, and then I'll
I think that
and let me add to it a little bit. I ask it because market hunting is what really led to the extirpation of so many species here in North America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you could, like the passenger pigeon's a great example, right? You could sell those pigeons. So now it's like I can't hunt a white-tailed deer and then go sell that meat, and that prevents there from being market demand that creates poaching and extirpation. Now, who was it we were talking to about this at his seaside home there? Bob Stenick. Bob said to me, well, you got to understand the ocean's different. Its level of productivity is so much higher than the land that it can sustain more. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting point.
I didn't think about that.
But yeah, curious for you what you think about, because with a cultivated, like you said, now there's no stress on that habitat or much less stress. So there's my preface.
I think also the taste and the texture of cultivated versus wild harvest is very different. And so I think just like any sort of product, people are going to have what they like better than others. Right. So, where Micah harvests his kelps are often in these like really wave swept environments, and you're going to get a different kelp that might grow there compared to in a
offshore rope.
Yeah. And so the texture of that phallus and that body is going to be different, and the tastes might be different. So I think.
How about the nutrient content?
Yeah, the nutrient content might be different too. So I mean, I think that all of that hasn't kind of played out in terms of any of that food science behind it and thinking about it. But I think there's opportunities for both. The wild harvest to remain and have aquaculture species, because not all seaweeds are easy to cultivate. So a good example is Ascophyllum is a terrible one to cultivate.
Okay.
It's so long-lived, and it takes forever from that baby zygote to grow up to be reproductive, that not many people would want to do that.
Right.
Versus kelps they have much quicker from that small spore up to that giant blade.
That's just a season, right?
That's just a season. Yeah.
Unbelievable to me. Yeah.
So that massive growth. So there are going to be certain species that are going to be more apt to cultivate, and others that you can only wild harvest to make it economically feasible.
What's your favorite seaweeds to eat?
Oh, so challenging. I love dulse.
Yeah, thank you.
I really love dulse. Actually, my favorite thing as a perfect thing to do on anything is this.
Okay, so that we're looking at a triple blend flake. So this is dulse. How do you say it? Laver?
Laver, which is nori.
And then sea lettuce. Now, a lot of people say they don't like sea lettuce, and I like it.
Yeah.
I kind of came up in this like superfood scene where we would get big bags of it, and I would eat it kind of just out of the bag.
Wow.
And a lot of people are like, oh, it's so fishy, but
I think it has a very...
it's the flavor of the sea.
It is. It is the flavor of the sea. I don't know if it's my favorite.
Yeah, not my favorite, but like in here where it's mixed with nori and dulse, and so this is like a sprinkle on.
It's like a salt shaker.
It's like in a salt shaker, but what I ended up doing is I put it on everything, and I make
I want to put it on some eggs right now.
Yeah, eggs are great. I make like a cheese cracker with it, and it's beautiful. I put it on sugar cookies too, kind of to add a little bit of salty to the sugar cookie, and it has a beautiful coloration because you've got kind of the purples and the reds and then the green that pops out. It's great for Christmas gifts.
Such an easy way to get your daily intake too.
Exactly. Just a little bit goes a long way.
Like stuck to your teeth.
We all just took a little.
That is really good. Have you ever heard this story? Someone told me that I've been trying to like get some corroborative evidence on this for a long time. Somebody once told me, it was an old timer, said when I was a kid, you go to the movie theater and they would have dulse as an option as well as popcorn, and that you could get like a roasted dulse in a paper bag, and they would eat it in the theater.
I've heard of that in the Maritimes, or maybe down east.
Okay,
like
cool.
Maybe
you're now the second
Jonesport.
person, so I've been like waiting for somebody to say yes, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Cool. So you like dulse?
I like dulse. I like ascophyllum and fucus.
Do you really?
I do, in a powder.
Okay, so you got to powder them down, of course.
Yeah.
Because they are hard to eat otherwise.
Or just the tips. So the kind of just the newest growth. So if you kind of clip little pieces of the tips and you can saute them, they're delicious too. I love nori, and I like alaria too. I think.
That's what I was waiting for. I know, it's like I'm over here, we're both on edge.
She's gonna say it.
Or alaria salad.
I do love alaria, and there's a wonderful salad in Pranny's cookbook that's alaria. That's just like really delicious.
And that book is Irish Seaweed Kitchen by Pranny Radigan?
Yeah, and she's an Irish medical doctor, like a primary care physician.
Oh, cool. We'll put a link to this book in the show notes.
Yeah, and she just has some great alaria. She has like a pumpkin and ginger with mixed seaweeds that has alaria, and then this alaria salad that's just phenomenal. It has marinated alaria. It's got cannelli beans and bananas in it, and mango.
Really?
It's like lots of different textures, but it's really good.
You need a photo of that page? Yeah, alaria's. I'm pretty blown away by it. It's like culinary, like the possibilities in the kitchen with it.
Exactly.
I mean, it's just amazing to me. We've been kind of marinating it in sesame oil, vinegar, ginger.
I candy it too. It's really good
How
candied.
do you do that?
You just kind of soak it with like a sugar syrup for a long time, and then you kind of coat it in sugar crystals and you bake it so that it kind of gets crispy.
Oh, no
And
way.
then I sprinkle it as like a garnish on cakes.
Come on.
It's delicious.
Wow, what else you got?
I know.
I know. Lay it on us.
Every Friday. So the way I teach my marine botany classes, it's from 11 to 12 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And every Friday it's Foodie Friday, and I feed them. As we're learning all the different algal lineages, I feed them all the different foods. So they just wait, and they're hungry at that period of time.
Neat. I'm hungry.
And so they've eaten some cyanobacteria, they've eaten some green algae, they've eaten some red algae, and so every week there's something that they have to eat.
How do you teach courses outside of, do people have to be enrolled here at the school in order to work with you, or do you do workshops that somebody listening could visit?
With a colleague, Nick Bluen, who's at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, we sometimes are able to teach at Eagle Hill Institute in Steuben, Maine, and it's open to the public. So
cool.
If anyone has never heard of Eagle Hill, it's like camp for adults.
Oh, cool.
And so it's natural history based, and there's lots of different workshops or seminars that you can take with like wetlands ecology, or there's a lot of mycology classes that they teach, and then we teach a phycology class. It's really cool.
All right, so we'll put that in the show notes as well, but it's called what again?
It's called the Eagle Institute.
Eagle Institute.
Eagle Hill Institute.
Eagle Hill. Okay, great.
And it's in Steuben.
Awesome. Any final thoughts that you have for folks?
I would have a pitch for if people want to get involved in doing research with seaweeds.
Please.
There are some citizen science projects.
Oh, tell us all about that.
For that. So that's kind of another part of what I end up spending time on is there are citizen science projects looking at invasive seaweeds that we have in the state and kind of monitoring their distribution and abundance. And so places like the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in Portland, Maine, has some of those kind of vital signs programs that kind of go out and you can identify and document where those seaweeds might be.
Wow, okay.
And I participate in using Ascophyllum as a phycology indicator species. So Maine Cooperative Extension and Maine Sea Grant have a program for phycology called the Signs of the Seasons. And there are, I think, between 13 and 15 indicator species, all of them except Ascophyllum being terrestrial. So it could be sugar maples and thinking about when their leaf change color happens, or when monarch butterflies are migrating through, and it's using just citizen scientists to go out and document and add to the database of where things are in their phycology. And so Ascophyllum is one of them. That's a marine indicator species because when it's reproductive is entrained in terms of thinking about water temperature. And so we're interested in looking at where it is at its stage of maturity of reproduction at different places along the coast. And so if people are interested in finding a plot of Ascophyllum that they want to adopt and monitor, we welcome people to join into that.
That's really cool because I think in part of our project at WildFed, part of what we are looking at is you're working with adults who don't have a background in ecology and who maybe don't even have much experience going into the natural world, who suddenly have developed an interest and are going like, what is my doorway into this?
Yep.
So something like this would be a way for somebody to sort of get some kind of introduction and be introduced to some species and actually like
absolutely
contribute.
It's called Signs of the Seasons?
It's called Signs of the Seasons. And actually the Eagle Hill Institute is perfect for that too. When Nick and I taught it the second time around, I think everyone in our class was over the age of 50.
Oh, cool.
And so it was amazing because I think in thinking about knowledge and knowledge base, oftentimes when you find something later in life, you have all of these life experiences to apply it to. And so so learning about endosymbiosis is not as abstract because you have sort of your life to kind of compile that information. When you try to tell a 18-year-old about endosymbiosis, their brain has not really developed fully to understand it sometimes.
Right.
So I find
sense.
that the older a student is for phycology, the more enthralled they are about it.
Okay, got it. And then for anybody who wants to follow up on any of the work you've been involved in or look more at what you do, where would they find some of your stuff?
They can always contact me. I have a contact information on the Maine Maritime Academy webpage.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time today.
My
You left me
pleasure.
feeling really excited about seaweeds.
Perfect. My mission is accomplished.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.